Welcome to Design Domination, where you'll learn to become a better, more business-savvy designer so you can dominate your competition. Hi, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Colleen Grotzer, and in this episode of Design Domination, I'm joined by a very special guest, Don Bolognese. Stick around to hear how he's seen all the changes in the design industry and why it's the talent, not the tool, to having a successful design and art career. Don is a graduate of the Cooper Union Art School, where he studied under some of the leading artists in New York City. Freelancing as an illustrator and a calligrapher, he quickly established himself in the publishing world and the New York art scene. Opening a print studio in Vermont, he and his wife, Elaine Raphael, began a long period of intensive creativity in the world of printmaking. Don's achievements in woodcutting earned him many commissions, among them the coveted Miracles of Christ exhibit, a series of large woodcuts and calligraphy for the Vatican Pavilion at the New York World's Fair. Following Elaine's passing in 2013, he began spending time teaching and working near Florence, Italy. Don drew inspiration from the Renaissance masters and their allegorical works depicting the important universal subjects using contemporary imagery. Reflecting on his time with Elaine, his daughter's lives, Christian texts, and the current political climate, he developed a novel perspective on the treatment of women in society. Over a period of 2 years, Don refined this perspective and successfully translated it to canvas with his masterwork, Good Friday 2019. When he began his painting, he truly understood the huge gap between his attempts and the master's achievements. Nevertheless, he was so inspired by the totality of their work that he continued working. No matter the gap between the master's accomplishments and the artist's desires, he knew he had no choice but to try to emulate their achievements in the context of today's challenges. With this painting, Don hopes to renew the centuries-old tradition of the artist as social observer and critic. To that end, the Relevance Project plans to resurrect the lives and works of past and present artists who pursue a goal of being relevant to current social issues. Welcome to the podcast, Don. I am really excited to be talking to you today.
Thank you. I'm really been looking forward to this opportunity because, as you've mentioned towards the end, I have this thing about artists as journalists. When I was teaching at Pratt and Cooper, I would always, which was really a book arts course, I would always begin by reminding the students that before 1850, there were no pictures other than those made by humans. And as a matter of fact, if you look back carefully at the art that's been done over these hundreds of years before photography, you find out upon real close examination that they are reflecting on society. Mm-hmm. It was a different time, and they were the only image makers around. So you can imagine the crucial spot they held in society, which is something they lost when photography came, which is an important thing to remember when you look at the path that art took after, let's say, the middle 1800s. Anyway, my feeling from very young, I grew up in during World War II, and my first commissions, I say that jokingly, but I was 8 or 9 years old, but I could draw better than any of the other kids. I was born with that talent. My mother was an artist. Her father was an artist in Italy. So I could draw, flying tigers and tanks and all those war machines that 9 and 10-year-old kids are fascinated by because they don't know about the other aspects. But that's what I was. I was sort of a war reporter for my friends, and I could draw all those machines and so on. Mm-hmm. But anyway, that was my first kind of understanding of how I could use this talent as a communication tool. I think one of the problems we have in the contemporary art field is that we don't understand that it was probably the first important communication tool before other things like the formal languages. I mean, all you have to do is look at the cave paintings, and you can understand that the urge to depict reality is almost close to breathing. I mean, it is for those who do it, because how else could they inform one another? Anyway, so I've always been interested in that, and I remember when I graduated from Cooper, I did have the opportunity to go to Yale Art School, which was being had formed, and I was going to get like a lot of my classmates, a complete scholarship, but it was really a fine art oriented thing, and I was not interested. I wanted to get out and illustrate, and within 2 years, I did have a couple of jobs. One as an art director for a small publishing house, which in the middle of it, I left, and I said to my wife Elaine, who was also an artist and fellow graduate of Cooper, I said, I'm never going to be an illustrator if I stick to a 9-to-5 job.
Mm.
And as nice as the job was and well paying, I said, I'm quitting. She said, okay. And that started my freelance career. And eventually Elaine came into it, and we formed the Raphael and Bolognese studio. And we did a lot of work together, primarily in the book publishing business, mostly children's books. We got to the point where weren't getting enough interesting commissions for illustration, so we decided to write our own books.
Oh, wow.
And that's what we did. We started to write our own books. We started with little picture books, and then we went on to a whole thing, which I call the Illustrator's Library, which went on to explain various techniques like pen and ink, pencil, charcoal, pastel, even printmaking. So we did that. That was sort of went hand in hand with the idea that I began teaching as a per diem instructor at Pratt and then Cooper and then NYU. I did that for about 12, 14 years until my workload was just so impossible that I couldn't even spare a day. So, but it was really, really a very, very important part of my understanding of what it is to be an artist. And that's what I think your listeners may be more interested in that, because contrary to the way art is presented in our society as an artifact, valuable or not, collectible or not, or whatever, the real thing about being an artist is the process of creativity.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is the thing that makes you get up in the morning and go to bed and wake up next morning with more ideas than you could possibly do in a lifetime. And it is what keeps you being interested in life. Because in my opinion, along with being an artist and being creative, is being curious and being imaginative. I mean, without curiosity, don't do much. I have met in my career artists who early in their career and come upon something that's very saleable, very good, and very, just attractive. I'm not saying it's cheap or anything, it's great. But the pressures of business end of art, of illustration especially, is that you have to repeat yourself over and over again, because that's what the public gets used to. Now, there are some artists who are very, very well adapted to do that. They don't mind that, they like it. They don't seem to get stale. But that was not the way Elaine and I approached it. We were constantly researching, looking back, and trying new techniques. I mean, I had a show a couple of years ago in Manchester, Vermont, which was kind of a retrospective show in a gallery, one of these pop-up things. And people would come in and say, well, how many artists were in your studio? Because we had all these various media that we worked in, and all the various styles, including the painting that you mentioned, along with a lot of woodcut, linoleum cuts, etchings, paintings, drawings, and everything. We didn't do any sculpture. That was one area we did not get into, mainly because the industry did not really want that. Anyway, so that's kind of the approach I've had. And I really can't stop working. I'm still working now. I've started this newspaper. And also my next thing is, anyone out there interested in this? I want to make a film of my story, The War Horse. It's a story set in Renaissance Italy, 1450, and it was very well reviewed. It sold all right, but when it came out, it was right in the midst of the Harry Potter thing, and it was just like so many other books that were just swamped by the whole Harry Potter phenomena. But at any rate, it has proved to have interest to other people in the business as a film, and I'm definitely getting started on that.
Well, that's great. I also want to get into like how we came to know each other too originally, because it's kind of funny.
Well, I I'm trying to remember. I think I saw you made a comment on maybe communication arts. Is that it?
Yeah. So
Is that how
actually, what happened first? I didn't even know about the communication arts mention of my podcast, but I did a podcast about Canva and why designers should
That's
not
right.
fear Canva. And then I saw that communication arts had shared it on social media, and then you emailed me, and
Yes.
you said that you don't really click on things in communication arts emails or something like that, and you did click through to look at my podcast / article on the website. And then you shared all these wonderful insights in your email.
Yes, because in this long career that I'm talking about, back in the early 1980s, just by a freak of circumstance, my a nephew, who was a prime programmer for the first computer graphics program that was done by New York Tech out in Long Island. And he said, "You're interested?" I said, "No." Again, the curiosity took over. And he said, "Yeah, you can only come out and work at midnight, because that's when all these computer nerds finally go to bed. And you can, because in those days, you needed a whole room of computers to get you, I think, I don't know how many, I forget what it was, some minuscule amount of power. But the point was, I worked on I was probably a handful of maybe 3 or 4 guys in the world who knew anything about computer paint programs.
Mm-hmm.
And I was absolutely astounded by what they had produced. And I did a couple of books. I think I've sent you the pictures of those books. Mastering, that's a kind of a, what should I say, exaggeration, mastering the art of computer illustration. Well, by the time it came out, it was a big coffee table book. It was obsolete, right? Because everything was happening so quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Nevertheless, I did set up a studio, and which was exclusively done. I had all this equipment that was loaned to me, because in those days it was hugely expensive. And I would do, things. I did the first, in New York City, I did the first ad that went from my computer to the printer.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, it was the first ad. I did it for, I think it was one of the big automobiles.
Mm-hmm. That was 1980?
It was like, by the time I got to that point, it was like 1985, 86.
Mm-hmm. Okay, 85,
yeah,
86.
right.
Yeah.
However, as I've said to other people who asked me about it, my hands rebelled. They said, "You're not drawing anymore, Don. You're not doing calligraphy anymore. What's wrong with what?" I'm useless, they said to me, my 2 hands. So I decided, you know what? It was I use this term, 2 programs for me, because one of the methods that we became addicted to during our time at Cooper was constant experimentation. We would experiment with media, we'd experiment with different tools. One of your questions here, the importance of new tools in art. And I approached computer graphic as a tool. I did not approach it as a thing, a full-fledged medium in itself. What I liked about it was its ability to make changes.
Yeah.
So I would, it's fantastic. I eventually did a book called 2050. It was about space travel. I did it for Scholastic. I did two volumes, and I did it a combination of real art, and I'd run it through the computer and be able to make all these. I love the airbrush effects that computer graphics could give me. Mm-hmm. I always liked the modulation, the chiaroscuro that it gave, because it was part of my technique, which was to always try to create form in whatever I was doing. So I found the airbrush capabilities of computer graphics to be fantastic.
Don't you think that there's like some limitations to tools? I mean, because like a lot of designers think that like if the client can use InDesign or Canva or Illustrator or something else, that it's not gonna make them a designer, right? And using those tools isn't gonna make you a better designer. But I think there's like limitations to the tools, because you've got your brain wants to like create something a certain way, and if you don't know how to do that in the tool, then it's going to change what you're able to achieve.
Right. Well, I would say that the tools, especially the computer tools, are double-edged swords. They can be fantastic when used correctly, and they can be restrictive when you don't have the imagination to go beyond it. So it's like any other tool. It's no different, really, I found. And the difference between, say, acrylic painting and oil painting, or no different, for example. I do a lot of printmaking, so I work with woodcuts, linoleum cuts, and my wife did a huge amount of work in multicolored etchings. Now, there's a method that really takes a lot of experimentation and skill, and it's really hard to replicate yourself. I mean, you're always battling something, some problem with color or chemistry or something. But the point I'm making is that the challenges you get from your tool, they are what make you expand. And my concern with, when I was teaching, my concern was, well, how should I put it this way? I used to jokingly say, I'm going to mark you on the weight of your sketches. So in other words, the more preliminary work you did, the better the final outcome would be. Of course, it wasn't always true, but it was a way to make young artists understand that they had to push the envelope at all times of their work. Now, sometimes it required just kind of imaginative thing, and other times, like in calligraphy, for example, it required in some of the printmaking things, required a disciplined approach in order to get as close to possible to work the medium to its limits. So you had to learn in calligraphy. You had models to follow that were historical, going way back to when calligraphy was the only writing form. The only way people could read anything was if it had been handwritten. There was no type. And that produced some of the most imaginative and, shall I say, I don't know, they were like, they provided the genesis for so much more that was to come later in let's say, typography. But to understand letter forms, and this is when I was in Rome, I was in Italy a couple of years ago, and I made a pilgrimage to the Trajan column, where I sent you something. And at the base of the Trajan column is a panel of the Roman alphabet, which we studied at Cooper Union because it was considered by calligraphers and typographers alike as the primary source of our alphabet. And everything that has happened since then, whether it was with serifs, without serifs, any kind of type design has that as its foundation. And I used to actually do Roman letters as a form of relaxation. But they are, when you look at them, they are the quintessential two-dimensional design. Curves working against other curves, straights. I mean, it's just beautiful. I did a lot of, and when I first started freelancing, I had my account was the Columbia Records, and I did a lot of calligraphy, Columbia Records, including The Sound of Music. I did that lettering. So I learned, I did tremendous amount of study in that thing. And finally, I got to see the original, a couple of years ago. It was wonderful.
That's amazing. Well, you were doing so much illustration and calligraphy. At some point over your 67-year career, did you ever get scared by the computer coming out or some other thing coming out? Whether like today it's Canva, tomorrow it's going to be something else. Like, did you ever have any fear about that when that came out?
Well, my wife and I learned something at Cooper Union that was very valuable. And what we learned was really how to use art history, how to use it so that it really, not as something to look back on as a lost perfection or something like that. No. We learned to use it as evidence of incredible experimentation on the part of those who produced what we were looking at. You have to understand that in the art of calligraphy and book illustration, the earliest forms are almost all gone. There was only, few, 3, 4, 5 total manuscripts that have survived from the so-called Dark Ages. The Book of Kells and a few others that are the Linsfarn Gospels. They are treasure troves. And I would say to all of your listeners that if you want inspiration, don't look at what's going on now. Look at when it went on 1,000 years ago. And I'm serious about that. Why? Because you are looking at things that were done when there was no thing to work on. This was coming from the the pure imagination of gifted people who had very, very limited tools compared to what we do today. I mean, imagine they had to make all their tools themselves. There were no calligraphy pens sold by Speedball or anything else. They had to cut these out, and they did them, and they had to grind their own ink, pigments to make ink, and the different colors that they got. They had to make their own paper, it wasn't paper, it was vellum, which is sheepskin, and so on and so forth. It was a total immersion. So that immersion does have an effect. You become married to your media that you're working with. And, you can see that in a lot of the great fine art work that's done too, because people do, the medium is their main thing. I mean, they're not telling, in contemporary art, they're not telling a story the way previous examples of art have. They are really telling you, describing their adventures with a medium and with their imagination. So there's a difference there, and you can get a lot out of it. And most of what you can get out of it is how much work they put into expanding whatever they're doing in their painting or sculpture. So that, it's very valuable to know the past art scene and the present art scene, but for different reasons. So we were always alert to what was happening around. That the studios that artists had in those days, this is going back way even before the Renaissance, but certainly it flowered during the Renaissance and thereafter as well. They did all sorts of things. They were like a real design studio. They did not only do the big historically remembered murals and whatever was necessary for the building of a church or whatever. They did a lot of things. They would do wedding invitations. They would do invitations to formal dinners. I mean, they were the graphic design studios that we have today. Only they were the only graphic design studios. I mean, everything had to be done by hand, and everything was either a painting, a print, a sculpture. Photography didn't exist. So you can imagine that art was a consummate experience for these artists. I mean, they lived it. They lived and breathed and existed in this studio space, along with their apprentices, some of whom, it's hard to understand this, but Leonardo and Michelangelo and all the big name guys, they were once apprentices. They worked in someone else's studio. And then, of course, they outgrew their master and they went on their own. And so that kind of experience is, I think, the most necessary thing. And just a little mention that when Elaine and I were students at Cooper, it was not yet an accredited liberal arts college as it is now. It was just a 3-year school that Peter Cooper set up in the middle of the 1800s for immigrants to work and learn about art and engineering and science. But he envisioned it mostly as a thing they did after work, night schools. And so, we benefited from the fact that not one of our teachers was a teacher. He was just a guy that did work. He was either a photographer, he was either an illustrator. We had a couple of book designers as teachers, and there was always an advertising guy there too. But they were all freelancers. They didn't really work in a corporate setting. So we had this kind of model that eliminated to some degree the fear of doing things on our own, because we saw that it was being done. It was not a goal. It was actually an achievement. And so we were very well prepared for entering the world of art, which is never an easy world, because
definitely not.
Lots of reasons. I mean, you know as well as I do, and it hasn't changed much. Nothing has changed. Even when I was one of the only artists in New York doing computer graphics, I would still have clients coming up to say, "Oh, that's wonderful that we can't pay that much." You know that story. Oh, you want to charge that much? Yeah, I have a room full of stuff here I got to pay for. I'm sorry, we can't pay more than X. I mean, those things never change. Right. And it happened back in the Renaissance too. You don't think that the Medici didn't take advantage of Botticelli? Of course they did. So anyway, that's another
Well,
story. But
I don't know if you've heard this story, and I don't know if it's actually true, but there's a story that Picasso drew some woman's portrait. Like she didn't actually like commission him to do it. Like I think they just like, I don't know if they were sitting on a bench or something, and he like supposedly, like she said, draw my portrait, and he did it in like a couple minutes. And then she said, how much do I owe you? And it was something crazy to her. And he said, she says, it only took you a couple minutes to do that. And he said, no, it took me a lifetime.
Yes,
to do that.
That's an apocryphal story, I'm sure, because I've heard that story with other artists there. But it is all true. It's all true, But that's fine on a one-on-one basis. But when you get into corporate life, as I'm sure many of your listeners know, it's business. It's business, and it was business for us too. We knew we were getting into in the publishing business. Unlike advertising business, does not pay that well. So what we decided, just a little, and plan to talk about this. We decided early on that we had to become authors as well.
Oh,
because there was royalties, and to that point, I'm still getting nice royalties from books I did 40 and 50 years ago.
Wow, really?
Yes, I have a contract with Amazon, and they have a whole maybe 12 or 15 books of mine that I get statements every few months on that they sell. I think they sell them mostly as download. I don't think they sell them as printed things, but the digital versions of it. And one of my biggest sellers over the years has been how to draw horses, because not many people know how to draw horses.
Really?
I can't tell you how many illustrator friends of mine would call me and say, I got to do a horse in this illustration. I can't even figure out which way the legs bend.
That's
and I would
funny.
help them out.
One thing that you said to me when we talked before you came on the podcast was, and I thought this was really interesting. So I'd love for you to explain it. You said the solutions are too easy in digital design.
That's right. And that goes back to what I said earlier about the process.
Right.
I mean, it is an amazing thing that they've done. These print. I am not going to downgrade what these computer scientists have done. That's fantastic. As a matter of fact, when I was asked to do it, they actually used those words. They said, we've done this stuff, but we don't know what it's going to do. We've never had and not one of us is an artist, so we don't know how to best use this stuff. So when I started working, then I did it for months. I would drive out any of you listening know about the Long Island Expressway? The only time to drive it is at midnight. Anyway, I'd go out there to New York Institute of Technology, and I'd come up with these incredible things. I do things. They said, "You really can do that with what we did?" I said, "Yeah, you can if you do this to it." So I was not impeded by that. But I will say this much. Let's take painting, for example, right? In computer graphics, because it's all numerical, you can, using the numbers, you can sort of make any kind of combination you want, right? Okay, so that's true. But on the other hand, painting, and especially painting, well, any of the acts we do physically, it is full of surprises that go beyond what you intend. And I think that's what is more under your control when you're working with your hands and with solid materials like a canvas or paint or paper or any of these things. When you're working with your hands, there are accidents. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good. But it's not the kind of thing that you have that somewhat in the digital world as well. But it's not as controllable. And I really firmly believe that all of these tools are as good as they are, and as say how they are expansive in a way of our ability to express ourselves. And there's no doubt about that. But they do have limitations, and the limitations are very, very critical in the sense that they don't make us really push our ability to create these things. For example, I had a friend in Vermont who has a gallery, and he had this painter, and they did this couple. They did a lot of landscapes, but they used the same green in every painting. I was amazed. I said, "Boy, is that boring?" And I said to myself, "Why don't they use different colors?" I mean, and I thought that was a failing on their part as as an artist. My wife with the beautiful landscapes, she never did the same green twice. She never did the same color twice.
Mm-hmm.
It was always something different. And I think that's a difficult thing for a machine to replicate in one's experience, in my experience at least. I mean, if I'm sitting down there and I have some basic greens and basic other colors, and I start fooling around with it and start playing with modulations and all that, first of all, it's much more satisfying than sitting at a keyboard. I mean, I should just leave it at that. But at any rate, I don't think we've seen the end of hand done work.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, I do not negate the amazing things that have come out through the digital world. It's fine, but everything has its place. You know.
Well, you've spent 67. I have to repeat that 67 years making a living in art, and that's
right.
like phenomenal. What do you think? And it doesn't have to be one thing, but what do you think are the biggest reasons that you've been able to make a successful living in art and design for so long?
Okay, yeah, it's good. It's a very good question. It's something that we would ask ourselves, and I think what it comes out of is that we were driven by the talent that we were born with to do this. As I said, art is a form of communication, and there are some things about us human beings that cannot be said only in words. You can produce things. Some people do it through acting, through music, but those few of us who have this visual talent that combined also with physical dexterity.
Mm-hmm.
I used to amuse and amaze my students in calligraphy.
Mm-hmm.
I'd stand in front of a chalkboard and I'd have two pieces of chalk in my left and right hands and simultaneously do calligraphy, both left and right hand. Only the left hand was done backwards. The right hand was done forward, because that's what your muscles do. Your muscles they have muscle memory. And if you don't think about it, I didn't think about it, I would just do it. And it would just work out like that. And everyone would, their jaws would drop. It was just a thing, I discovered one day that I could do that. But that's what I mean about the human capability. While the digital world is full of the surprises, so are we. And we should not neglect the opportunity while we have it to do that.
Mm-hmm. One thing you had said too to me briefly was that these traditional artists, you said at New York Tech, one of my duties as the traditional artist was to give demonstrations to the Art Directors Club, the Society of Illustrators, etc. The reaction was always the same, very personal and very angry. And frankly, I couldn't blame them because their anxieties were well-founded. Entire graphic design studios were faced with two alternatives: either get out of that business or accept the inevitable and retool and retrain, which is a very costly decision that many simply could not afford.
Exactly. And that's exactly what happened. I was amazed that, when we first started doing it, of course, my wife and I, because when I learned, she learned too. So we would give, at the behest of the New York Institute of Technology, they had rented a studio room, a big room at the top of the Chrysler building, very, very top. And we would have art directors come up and anyone in the art field. And we would do demonstrations, and they were like upset. And I didn't blame them at all.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact of the matter is, when I started as a freelancer, there were many, what should I call, businesses or disciplines that I would depend on. I would have to send out for photostats, I would send out for type, send out for this, for that, retouching, blah, blah. But now, studios were no longer necessary. And a lot of artists who were serious artists were sometimes making a living as best they could, working in these, shall I say, supportive industries, supportive aspects of the graphic design field. I mean, any young man or woman going into the graphic design field right now, what they're looking at, they're not looking at places to work. They're looking at capabilities, like computer capabilities that can somehow expand and express their talents. Mm-hmm. Because it's all been wrapped up in that thing. I mean, I could sit down now and design a whole book from the very beginning to typography, whatever I wanted to do, illustration, blah, 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 and actually get into the production process as well, pretty closely, even including, if I wanted to do it on a very limited basis, a demand printing. So in other words, I wouldn't have to go to anyone. Whereas when I was starting out as in the business, first as an art director and then as an illustrator, I had a whole bunch of people that were supporting my work from the lowly. As a matter of fact, this is a little funny story. I'm trying to remember when it was. It was in the late '60s, and I decided that I lived in Brooklyn, and I decided that every time I needed a photostat, I'd have to go into Manhattan to get one. So I said, "This is ridiculous," and so I went and looked for a secondhand photostat machine. And I'm sure none of your listeners or viewers have ever seen what I bought. It was about 8 feet long, with bellows. It had a fantastic lens, and I would do my own photostats. And I'll have to send you this. And so one day I was doodling, and I did doodle this little drawing, which was only a few inches big, with a very fine pen. And I said, you know what? I could blow this up into a story, and I did. And the story became Once Upon a Mountain, and it's an anti-war story about two mountains the inhabitants of which get upset with each other. All of a sudden, a whole world opened up for me. I could blow this stuff up. I could do this and that. And I published it, and it got nice reviews, and it was a nice little anti-war story called Once Upon a Mountain, based on a very old folktale. So that was one way where the technology of that time increased my imagination. It enabled me to take something which was just a kernel of an idea and turn it into a big thing. And I think when one uses whatever tools they're using now, whether it's digital or otherwise, remember that in the experience of conquering the technical difficulties that are with any medium, it doesn't mean whether it's paint or digital, in that pursuit, you grow as an artist. You grow because you have to use your imagination. You have to experiment. You have to learn what works and what doesn't work. And I think that is why, in my opinion, digital art, whether it's Canva or anything else, Photoshop, has its limitations. It has a great kind of exciting and liberating kinds of things too. As I mentioned before about my own experience was doing airbrush. That was so much easier than having to learn it, because I know airbrushes, airbrush artists very well, and it's a bear. The real airbrush artists always had a technical problem getting the right liquidity there and everything, keeping the. But the point was they went. By the way, they went out of business too. As a matter of fact, I know one guy who had just gotten to the point where he learned how to do traditional airbrushing, and then all of a sudden it was gone, and he had to learn all over again. And he was a mature person. And he learned all over again how to do it the other way. But he's still doing it, so that's good. Anyway, I don't know if that answers your original question, but for us it was an ongoing the introduction of new material into an old tradition. Let's say I'll use printmaking as an example because it was really one of the wonderful things that made our life very interesting. My wife, who went to Cooper Union as I did, and she was a very good artist, did beautiful painting and all, developed at Cooper, limited time we had to do it, an affection for printmaking. And so when she was in her 40s, she went back to school to learn printmaking at the Pratt Graphic Center in Manhattan. She worked there for a couple of years. And we were doing some nice things. And she said, we had a little press in our apartment, our studio plus apartment in New York City. And it was not adequate to where her vision was. I went out, the two of us went out, and we bought this huge press, handmade press. It was a fortune. But we had this farm in Vermont, a little farmhouse that we'd gotten, and we had it delivered up there. And in the studio we had up there, and she started doing big prints and so on. And it was like an explosion of creativity for her. But it was dependent on this beautiful machine, which was a very basic machine going back centuries. Etching and engraving go way back. And so it wasn't a traditional thing, but the challenges of doing it, whether it was the etching process or the engraving process or the printing process, a lot of processes involved in doing a print, by the way. And you learn a tremendous amount. I should say you have to learn a tremendous amount. but it also expanded her level of, I should say, deepened her level of expression. Her etchings are beautiful. And so the marriage of artist with tool is essential. And I worry, one of the things that I worry about with the digital media is that it replicates these things. I mean, you've seen what I've seen. You take a picture, photograph, let's say a photograph of you, right? You can run it through all these programs that turn it into a woodcut or this and that. You know what I'm talking about. Or give it a feeling that it's an impressionist painting or it's a this or that, whatever. And all that's kind of interesting for the do-it-yourself people who are not artists, you know, which, by the way, was another great fear that I encountered. People say to me, you know, our clients, I mean, they won't need us anymore, you know, they don't need us anymore. You know, the copywriter, he gets a hold of one of these things. He doesn't need me to create an ad for him anymore. He can do this.
So they thought it was going to turn them into a designer because they could use the
right. And it doesn't work that way, but
no.
certainly for some people it was adequate enough. And maybe you could say, who the hell needs a client like that anyway, right? But sometimes you need bread and butter clients. I mean, let's face it, this is one still has to make a living in this business. And I'm grateful for the fact that in publishing, it was a little, although it again did not pay that well, it gave us a good living. I mean, it was fine. We weren't starving. And the point was, it gave us a much greater opportunity to do interesting things, including from our inception. I mean, you're working in a studio, let's say a design studio that does mostly advertising for corporate. You're not in there at the creative beginnings of things. You're doing there to carry through something that someone else has created. But with us, we were able to start. We started with our own thing. And all we had to do was convince a publisher or an editor or an art director that, we should publish this thing. Is this idea we have? Yeah, sure, why not? And of course, that was a big thing. But we managed to, as I said, have a career that went on 6 decades. And we were still doing things that were original and that did sell and are still alive, as I said, on Amazon. You still buy them. And, you know, what can I say? I think I attribute that to the fact that we never relaxed. We never settled down and I have some friends also in the book industry who've done very well, but they did the same thing for 40, 50 years. Same style, and the style was very successful. And every year you have a new bunch of readers, so it didn't necessarily mean anything that the style was the same because it wasn't the same population you were selling it to. So, but it was very saleable. But we just could never do that. I mean, it was just not in our making, you know. We just, I was doing a line of books for a very well-known publisher. And finally, the stuff I was getting was so boring and so repetitive that I turned it down. I'm not doing it anymore. By the way, one little thing that I take credit for that in the publishing business that many of your listeners probably are not aware of is if they look back in the books that were printed back in the 60s and 70s, you don't find too many children's books which are full color because it was very expensive. So, and I was, of course, very busy doing that. I would do, and anyone out there listening, if you ever try to do a separated piece of artwork, it's got a challenging thing. And I challenge you to do a 4-color separated piece of artwork, which I had to do sometimes because of constrictions, you know, price constrictions on the book. But they wanted it full color, and all I had to do was to break it down into 4 plates. So I did that. But then came some sort of revolution, and all of a sudden books could be done in full color more and economically. And there was this one line of books that I did that was a very big line, and they had a lot of books in there that were like 2 or 3 color books, and they wanted them to be turned into full color. So they asked me to do the first one. So I did a book that was very successful, and it had been done, I think, with black and 2 colors, and I turned it into a full color job. What I did was to take the black plate and I just printed it on a very good Xerox printing on a very good watercolor paper, and I just colored the things in it. But they asked me to do that, and then they had all their other illustrators do that. And we did the book, and it's still selling and selling well.
Wow.
We did it. So I was part of that revolution where the book industry decided, hey, we've got to be competitive. Everything is full color now. So we got to turn some of our old good sellers that were only in black and white or black and white in one or two colors into something more exciting, more acceptable. So, and they did a lot of them then.
I was thinking, the ways of getting clients too has changed so much over the years, because you were working and I was working well before social media, getting into this business too. So what were you, and you were saying you published your own books, but what other kinds of things were you doing to get clients? Like, were you showing art in a gallery, or were you approaching publishers?
Oh, no,
How was that
never.
working?
We tried showing art in the gallery early on in our career. And let me just tell you something. You know the old expression that one rotten apple will ruin a whole bunch? Well, let me tell you, the same thing is true for a gallery show. If you have a group show and you have one or two that are really horrific, that's all that people remember. They don't remember the good stuff. So after one or two experiences like that, we said, never more, forget it. We were too busy working in our field, and we were going to we just dropped that whole thing. Besides, we like being illustrators. It was more fun.
So where were you going to look for, how are you getting new clients over the years?
Well, in publishing, it's easy, because once you get a book published, that's your portfolio.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we did. The minute we got a book published, or even got working on it, I'd take it around to another publisher and say, we're doing this series on that. When do you think you should do a series like that? Or something, I'd come up with an idea. I remember one time, very, very clearly, we had reached a point, it was in the 1980s, and there was all sorts of things going on with television and everything else. Mm-hmm. And publishers were losing their grip on children, so to speak. It was going over to, I don't know, what, Sesame Street or whatever it was going over. And so we sat down more than once and said, look, let's do something that they can't get otherwise. And let's do it as a series, because we won't have to work that hard for each book. Mm-hmm. If we can sell a publisher on a series of 4 or 5 or 6 books, it would be great. And we did. We did a few series for Scholastic, for Harper's, and a few other mainstream publishers, and they were happy to do that, because it's easier to sell a series than it is to sell a single title. Mm-hmm. So we did that. But in other words, we had to be nimble as well, not only in our artwork, but in our approach to the business end of it.
There was something you said in your email. This is kind of going back to when you were talking about calligraphy earlier, but you said, and talking about like the computer does a really good job of replicating. And you said that really great calligraphy is like the performance of a violin virtuoso. Even the most accomplished technique is entirely forgettable without the presence of soul.
That is absolutely true. And in my teaching experience, and in the experience I've had since, I keep in touch loosely with things that are going on in the calligraphy field. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons we did not, I could have. I'll send you some things I did for Columbia Records. I could have gone on strictly, never going beyond illustration. As a matter of fact, it was very funny. When I went out showing my portfolio, I did not show everything, because people, though art directors out there, are you listening? You're kind of what's the word? Fixated on what the latest problem you're having. And I remember this is very funny. I had done a lot of work for this one publishing company, very good editor, and I was doing this series on ancient civilizations, Egypt, Greece, and Rome. So we came to the Roman one, and I had the scene in the arena showing how the Romans would import all these animals and have them part of a big thing, and they'd be killed by people. It's horrible, but they would do that. Among them was elephants. And she turned to me, she said, Don, have you ever drawn an elephant? And I thought that was so funny, because she'd known my work for years. And I said, the truth of the matter is I had never drawn an elephant. Okay? I said, of course I could draw anything. But that is the sort of a state of mind that is in a lot of art directors' heads, that they have to get specifically something. And you'll see a lot of portfolios of commercial illustrators that they focus on this, they'll focus on fruit, or they'll focus on houses, or they'll focus on this or that. so they get to know that they have a niche. But that was anathema to us. We did not want to be considered a niche kind of artist. We wanted to handle anything that came up. We didn't accept everything, but we just knew that we could. And one of the ways of doing it was to do a series. So in that drawing series, I had how to draw horses, but how to draw spaceships.
Totally different.
Totally different, you know?
Well, that's really interesting about the,
yeah,
you did not want to have a niche, but nowadays, like, that is like how a lot of, I speak about like how important niches are. So because there's so many graphic designers out there, so many web developers out there. How are you going to stand out?
Right. Well, you know, I went at Cooper Union, and there were some really great people who graduated from Cooper Union, and the one we just lost, Milt Glazer, Pushpin Studios, and I did work for them when I first got out of school. I did some I forget, they were done on film strips. I think film strips were very big in those days. I did some film strips for them, full color things. But I mean, Milt Glazer was a barrier tearer down. You know, he did a lot of things. He was a very good draftsman, but he was a terrific designer. And he took a lot of chances, and so did Seymour Cross, and so did this whole bunch. John Alcorn, great designer, died much too soon. But these were guys who, what they learned from Cooper Union was, you don't stop experimenting. Don't take the first solution that comes into your head, even though that may be the one you go back to and use. Just keep pushing it, see what happens. And I think if I have anything to say to your listeners, I would say that. I would say, forget about what the business that you're in is requiring. Just look at it from every different way you can. That's all I can say. Is just do not accept. And I know that in advertising, the demands are much more precise than they are in publishing. But even in publishing, there were times, and I had one or two instances where I could not argue. It was either a question of I did the change, or they were just not produce the work. And I had one or two times when I had to do that. I did it the best I could, but nevertheless, it was not something that I would have done on my own. But I had very, very, very few instances like that, thank God. You know?
Well, we never got into the fun questions in the beginning. I wanted to run through those really quick. Do you eat the heel of the bread or toss it?
I never, because if it gets stale, I grind it up and use it as breadcrumbs, which I use in my Italian cooking.
Oh, what a great idea. Oh, my husband just made these wonderful croutons the other day, and he hates croutons normally, but he took bread and he just, a roll, and he just, crumbled it up to big croutons, but then put some olive oil, salt, and pepper on it. Oh, it was so good. So good. Like, I would never eat a boxed crouton again.
Exactly. That's the point, right? I think most important thing that I wanted to get through to your listeners was the idea that the essential aspect of becoming an artist is being creative and experimenting. And the idea, I used to get a kick out of art directors who say to me, so what's it going to look like? I said, what do you mean what's it going to look like? You know what I can do, but it wouldn't be very creative if I could tell you what it's going to look like, because I don't know what it's going to look like. That's the essence of creativity. You don't know what you're going to make until it's made. And that's a process, and I'm sure that in many cases, even with the book business, what we came up with was not what maybe they were thinking about, but they were happy with it. And in many cases, it was very successful, both financially and as got awards and so on and so forth. But the fact that I'm still working is an example of the fact that that approach must be good, Well, and the other thing I really wanted to do, and I'm very glad that we're doing this, is I wanted to, after my wife died, I did something that I thought was a real tribute to what she had done. She liked teaching young people, and she would do it just in an ad hoc way. I mean, they come into the studio and they watch her work, and we had grandchildren, and she put them to work doing all sorts of artwork, and they loved it. She was a kind of a stealth teacher. She never was overbearing, and she just gave them plenty of opportunity to do the things they wanted to do. And they had really good they had really good examples because her work, my work, they could see,
Mm-hmm.
quality is quality no matter what style you're using. So that was it. And I wanted to continue that. So I did the Elaine Foundation Art Fund. And what we do, and it has stopped because of COVID, but we were very successful doing these drawing workshops
Mm-hmm.
where we accomplished two things. We got young kids to draw from life. I think one of the things I've noticed lately, some young illustrators that I've met and through neighbors and so on, and people asking me to look at it. What I find a little disturbing is that they are imitating some of these the latest trends. I don't know how to even describe it. Kind of
Mm-hmm.
fantasy type of stuff, very rendered and everything else. They look boring to me and they look unimaginative to me.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what they're doing, and I don't think that's a good way to start your life as an artist. You're going to start with what you have, and it's not going to be great, but you have to work on it, and you have to continue to. You have to find models that you like, and as I said earlier, do not look at what your peers are doing. Go back in history. If you're an illustrator, look at the history of illustration. If you're a painter, look at the history of painting. If you're in type, go to the early type examples of type and how they develop. Look at the traditions of things, because that's where you'll find the building blocks for your own style. If you work only from what your peers are doing and what's popular, you'll just never get beyond that. You'll just be, at best, an imitation of the most successful of what you're doing. And so that's it may work, it may be rewarding in the short term, but it's going to make your life boring. I remember, and occasionally when I would go to alumni things and I'd meet artists who were graduates of whatever school, Cooper or whatever, and who retired. And I said, "What are you doing now?" They had worked in studios, mostly advertising. And he said, "Oh, I don't touch illustration anymore. I just do something else to do." And I said to myself, that's too bad, because that was a natural talent they had. But they had spent so many years, in a sense, suffocating or editing that talent to fit the needs of a client who lacked the imagination that they had, but would not allow them to use it because of whatever. And this was something that when I first got when I first graduated, best story, I was recommended to a company that you probably haven't heard of, but it was the Container Corporation of America. And back in the 1950s, it was the global corporation, and their ads were so great. We'd all look at them. What they would do would commission great art, fine art, for their ads, and they would just, they were like, we're above it all, right? We're a global company. We do all the packages for the world. But look at this. We are really associate ourselves with real creativity. So I got a job. My first job out of school, out of Cooper, was as a designer in one of their plants out in Philadelphia. And what they offered their clients was, I think it was more or less free. The design was free, but where they made their money was in the packaging, not in the design work. And they did a lot of towel boxes. And for the first few months, my wife and I, because I got her involved in it too, we did towel designs and everything like that. But I ran afoul of the art directors because I was a pain in the ass. I mean, I just didn't. They would say, "Well, we had a focus group, and green is out." I said, "You're going to take green out of a towel box? Really? I can't use green in my designs for towel where you want flowers and stuff like that?" I said, "That's ridiculous." And I refused to bend. And so what they did was to consign me to doing comps of 6-point type on medicine bottles, on vitamin. I tell you, it was the biggest.
No.
I used to come home and tell my wife, I said, my head shook all day because I had to keep my hands steady. I was doing 6-point type comps. In those days, everything was done by hand. There was no computer to help with that.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Finally, they got fed up with me, and I got the proverbial, Don, I want to meet you in the cafeteria for a cup of coffee.
Oh, no.
You know what that meant. So I left there. We moved back and came back to New York, and I had a job. I had two job offers, one for a pharmaceutical ad agency. In those days, the pharmaceutical advertising business was the class act in advertising. And then the other job was as a publisher, small publisher, but a very prestigious publisher. And I took the art director job as the publisher, which I lasted only about maybe a year. 3 months after my first child was born, that's when I told my wife, I can't do this anymore. I mean, I was 22 years old, and I was already an art director, and I could have probably gone right up the ladder in different big publishers and so on. But, I was giving out work and not liking the work that was coming back, because I thought, I can do that better. So I said, well, you better put your mouth you better put your drawing hand where your mouth is. And I said, the only way I could do that, though, the way the industry was constructed, you could not become a freelance illustrator. I mean, you would not become a full-time illustrator unless you went freelance. And I admired work of the N.C. Wyeth caliber work from the 30s. So I knew where to go but freelance. So I did. Never look back, as the saying goes.
Such a career. Yeah. Where can listeners find the foundation?
Yes, it's livingforcause.org.
Wanted to say this has been really great, and I am really grateful that you came on. You're like a design celebrity in this space, and it's really been an honor to talk to you on the podcast.
Well, I think it's been, thank you for the opportunity, because I do really feel at this stage in my life that I would like to help any other young artists, or even old artists, looking for should I say, encouragement, or some sort of, I don't know what. But as a matter of fact, I have a biography I'm working on. It's called Art is Life. She had a favorite expression, either she came up with or she found it. Art is life and life is art. Think about it.
Yeah, those are great words to end with, too.
Thank you, Colleen. I really do appreciate this opportunity.
As always, check out the episode page for show notes. For this episode, you can also see some of Don's work. Go to creative-boost.com/podcast, episode 132. If this content was helpful, you can support the podcast by buying me a coffee. It might actually end up being a glass of wine or some tea, but you can go to buymeacoffee.com/creative-boost.